Britain is supposedly getting richer. The economy is larger than it was 20 years ago. GDP has grown. Politicians regularly celebrate economic growth, even if it's in the decimal points. Yet millions of people feel poorer. Housing is less affordable. Public services are under pressure. Real wages have barely moved for years. Many young people feel that there are fewer opportunities than their parents. So what's going on? How can GDP keep rising while so many people feel left behind? Have politicians been measuring the wrong thing? Yes. Or is GDP hiding Britain's real economic problem? For decades, GDP has been the headline measure of economic success. Every teenager learns it in geography, even before GCSE. Governments celebrate rising GDP like it's a great achievement from them. Opposition parties attack weak GDP growth as though they could do something better. International organisations compare countries using GDP. So it seems sensible, right? GDP measures the value of goods and services produced within a country. More production, more economic activity. More economic activity means a larger economy. Larger economy means everyone does well, right? But there's a catch. It doesn't measure prosperity. In fact, one of the architects of GDP, the economist Simon Kuznets, warned against using national income as a measure of welfare or success. GDP measures output, doesn't measure happiness, doesn't measure living standards, doesn't measure wealth distribution, and certainly doesn't tell you whether ordinary people are becoming more prosperous. Because Britain's economic debate increasingly focuses on GDP, but ignores the factors that actually affect normal people. During the post-war period, economic growth translated into better wages, higher productivity and increasing prosperity. GDP was therefore a reasonably good proxy for progress. The problem is the relationship has broken, it's become weaker. GDP measures the size of the economy, not the number of people in it. And why does that matter? Because total GDP can rise by 5%, but if the population rises by 10%, you're not all better off. People don't experience the economy collectively. They experience it individually in how much money goes into their pocket and what they can buy with it. Whereas productivity measures how efficiently workers and businesses create output. Now, when Liz Truss talked about this, she was mocked and ridiculed and held up to disdain for suggesting that the British people were unproductive. But productivity is an economic measure, not a judgment. It's not how hard people are working. It's the ratio between the amount produced versus the people. And businesses have become more competitive. Wages have increased. Tax revenues have grown. But living standards haven't improved. Since the financial crisis of 2008, productivity growth has slowed dramatically. Economists have called it the productivity puzzle. It's certainly puzzling our Chancellor. Before the crisis, productivity typically increased by about 2% annually. Since then, it barely moves at all. This matters because long-term prosperity ultimately depends on productivity. Governments can borrow money, central banks can stimulate demand and print new money. Public spending can support economic activity, but sustainable improvements in living standards require people and businesses to become more productive, collectively. Without productivity growth, prosperity eventually stalls. So when you have more and more people not working, and then you bring in more and more people to replace those people who aren't working, without looking at the systemic issues in the system, you aren't producing greater productivity, but you are creating more GDP. More people are spending more money. The fact that a lot of that money is going round and round because You're buying them a phone and a house and a place in a hotel and free meals and healthcare. If they're not producing, the GDP might have gone up, but the GDP per capita hasn't. Now, since 2008, housing costs have risen sharply, energy bills have gone through the roof, taxes have remained high. Stealth tax, by not increasing your allowance, has eaten more and more. And the truth is, we've gone through one of the longest periods of wage stagnation in modern history. If you've had a pay rise, you either work for the public sector or you actually had a promotion. And without growth in wages, Britain has become overly dependent on housing and asset inflation rather than productive investment. Now, if you're not one of those lucky enough to have a piece of that pie, you're worse off. When you have regional disparity, London is one of the most productive regions in Europe. How does that feel for the Londoners? Other parts of Britain have experienced much slower growth. When economists combine these experiences to a single national figure, local realities simply evaporate. A rising national GDP coexists with stagnation in many towns and regions. So what do we need to do? Focus on productivity. Improve productivity. Secondly, investment. Britain struggles with weak business investment compared to competitors. Thirdly, infrastructure, but meaningful infrastructure where we actually look at how much it's costing. Fourthly, skills and education so that people can actually support those higher wages. Fifthly, housing reform, reduce distortions in the housing market. Finally, policymakers should rely on more indicators than just GDP. They should look at GDP per capita, productivity growth, median incomes, living standards. Economic success should be measured not by the size of the economy, but how effectively growth improves people's lives. Because ultimately, economic success should be measured not by the size of the pie alone, but by whether ordinary people are actually getting a larger slice of it.